In this video, I'll show you how to make soft, fluffy, and sweet sourdough Hawaiian rolls. I was kind of freestyling this recipe, so you'll see that I messed up the first batch a little bit, and I'll show you how I made them even better on the second batch. So the night before you're ready to make your rolls, go ahead and get 25 grams of sourdough starter out of the fridge. Add to that 100 grams of water, and then give that a good stir with a spoon. You want to dissolve all that leftover starter from last time into the water. Then add 100 grams of bread flour to the water and starter mixture. So that's 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of water. You'll end up with 200 grams of active sourdough starter and a little bit left over to put in the fridge for next time. Let your starter sit out at room temperature overnight or for about 8 hours or so until it doubles in size and looks something like this. My starter doubled in size overnight and it was ready to use. So in order to make a sourdough version of these famous grocery store sweet Hawaiian rolls, I found a Copycat recipe online that I tweaked to make it a sourdough version. And the first attempt I had at making these was definitely a learning experience for me, and I have a few things I want to show you that I learned in the process. So the original Hawaiian rolls use an enriched dough that's sweetened with sugar and some pineapple juice. So I started off making a 65% hydration dough. That's 112 grams of water and then 112 grams of just this grocery store pineapple juice. Of course, the fresher would probably be better. Then I added some regular enriched dough bread things, 10 grams of salt, 65 grams of sugar. I used a raw sugar, but you could use white sugar too. And of course, instead of yeast, I'm using my active sourdough starter that I made the previous evening, 200 grams. Then I added one standard egg, which is about 50 grams. Then I'm adding 1 teaspoon of vanilla to enhance the sweetness and the sensation of creaminess. And I'm just going to stir all of that together. Besides the flour, those are the basic ingredients for an enriched dough, of course with a little bit of vanilla and pineapple juice, which should make these Hawaiian rolls a little bit unique. Then I added 400 grams of bread flour, which brought the total to 500 grams of flour in the recipe when you count the flour that was already in the starter. Then I moved it onto the base of my stand mixer and started mixing it just until it came together to form a dough. And once it all came together, I realized, yeah, this is a really wet dough. And I didn't want to just keep adding flour until it turned into a thicker dough. That would throw the ratios out of whack. So I kept it as a really wet dough and just decided I was just going to keep kneading it in the stand mixer and hope for the best. So over the next 5 minutes or so, I kept kneading the dough and I added in 57 grams of butter. That's half a US stick. I did that in a few chunks of softened butter, just one at a time. Once one of the chunks disappeared, I would add in another chunk of butter and keep going until that disappeared. And then I would do the same thing with the last one until all of the butter was dissolved into the dough. And once the butter was fully incorporated into the dough, that's when I let the full kneading begin. I let the dough knead in the stand mixer on the second setting for about 10 more minutes. And I was expecting this dough to be fully developed and to hold together, not really stick to the sides of the bowl, but I was wrong. The dough was still pretty wet and sticky, and I was a little disappointed, but I wanted to stick it through to the end, and I'm glad I did. I scraped down the sides of the bowl so I could get all the dough in one place at the bottom of the bowl. Then I covered it up and let it rest for about 30 minutes on the counter in hopes that the dough would hold together a little bit better. So 30 minutes later, I just put some flour on the counter and I tipped out the dough onto that floured surface. And luckily the dough was holding together not perfectly, but it was manageable at least. So on the counter, I gave the dough a couple stretch and folds, just stretch and folding each side so it held together like this. Then I flipped it over and I formed the dough into a ball with my hands. After that, I carefully transferred the dough into an oiled glass bowl with this lid. I really like this bowl because I can see through the sides of it, see how much the dough is growing. And I popped the lid on and just let the dough sit there on my counter for about 3 more hours until it was doubled in size and looking like this. So to divide and shape these rolls, I floured my counter, tipped out the dough onto the counter, flour side down, sticky side up, gave it a few stretch and folds so I could just knock the air out of the dough a little bit. Then I got my non-stick 9x13 pan that I use for pizza and focaccia and stuff like that, and I started dividing and shaping the rolls. You could divide the dough into 16 equal pieces by eye and just try to get as equal of pieces as possible. I decided to weigh my dough balls into about 60-gram pieces. Here's how I shaped them. I would get a piece that weighed about 60 grams, I would dip one side in flour, and then I would stretch and fold the dough until it formed a tight dough ball just like this. I went around as many times as I needed to, keeping the sticky side underneath and forming a seam on the bottom. Then I sprinkled the top again with flour just because these are really sticky. I already told you the dough is way too wet and sticky. I'm definitely going to fix that. Then I rolled the dough ball gently on the counter and placed it into the pan right next to the other rolls. Then once I had all 16 rolls shaped and into the pan, I covered them up with a kitchen towel and let them proof on the counter until they were doubled in size. It took about 3 hours. Once they were proofed and ready to bake, I actually first brushed them with 1 beaten egg, just gave them a brushing with an egg wash. I do this with brioche and other enriched doughs. It gives them a shiny brown top. Not sure if that's what they do with the original Hawaiian rolls, but I figured I would just give it a try. After the egg wash, I moved these into a preheated oven. I preheated it to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, and I let these bake for a full 20 minutes at 450 degrees. That's the time I usually bake dinner rolls for, 20 minutes, so I was expecting that to turn out fine, but honestly, these were a little darker brown than I wanted for the Hawaiian rolls that I was trying to imitate. I'm not saying I always want to make bread that tastes store-bought, but on this quest to make grocery store-style Hawaiian rolls, I knew there's 2 things I wanted to fix. I wanted the dough to be a little bit stiffer and easier to handle, and I wanted the final rolls to not be quite as dark, to be a little bit softer, to come a little bit closer to those grocery store style Hawaiian rolls. After brushing these with melted butter and waiting barely 2 minutes before I tore into these, I finally got to try them, and I've got to admit, even though the dough was a little difficult to manage and the tops were a little browner than I was looking for, they were super soft in the center. I really liked the texture of these rolls, and the flavor was amazing. Just a light sweetness from the sugar, and the pineapple juice really gave it a kind of tropical feel that you don't get in any other type of roll. It's probably what makes these popular in the first place. Okay, so I knew there were 2 things I wanted to fix to make this recipe even better. I needed to change the ratios of liquid to flour in the recipe to make the dough a little bit easier to handle. And I wanted them not to be as brown on top as they ended up being, so I'm going to decrease the bake time just to try to get them to be more golden brown, like the ones that I get at the store. So here's my round 2. For this next try, I made a dough that's a lot stiffer. I still used a good amount of pineapple juice in the dough so I would have that tropical flavor, but it was a lot lower hydration. I'll include the written recipe for both of these doughs in the video description. As you can see, this dough was a lot easier to handle, so I think I fixed that problem. It was so easy to handle, I could even knead it by hand on the counter, the butter and everything. I just incorporated the butter into the dough by hand, just like I did with my sourdough brioche recipe that I published last year. So once this dough was fully kneaded, I moved it to a glass container and let it bulk ferment for about 3 hours at room temperature until it was doubled in size. Then just like with the first batch of dough, I individually portioned these into about 60-gram pieces, dipped them in flour, gave them a few stretch and folds to form tight balls, rolled them up, and these were definitely a lot easier to shape than the first batch. So I lined those all up in the baking sheet, covered them up, and let them proof on the counter for another 3 hours. And once they had doubled in size, I knew I needed to work on the second problem I wanted to fix, which was the color. I wanted these to come out a little bit lighter on top, so I just brushed them with egg wash the same way I did the first ones. Instead of lowering the temperature in the oven, I decided to keep them baking at the same temperature, but for less time. So I popped them into the 450-degree oven and baked them for an initial 10 minutes just to check on them. And 10 minutes clearly wasn't enough time. They didn't look fully cooked yet, so I kept them going for another 5 minutes. And after 15 minutes of total baking time, they had the grocery store style light brown color that I was looking for. So I did my 2 fixes. The color was lighter than the original, and I got the dough to be easier to manage. But none of that really matters if they don't taste good. So now it was time for the taste test. After buttering them up and taking a really silly picture for my YouTube supervisor, it was finally time to tear one open and give it a taste. Overall, I am very happy with how these turned out. I'm a real sucker for those flat edges on pull-apart rolls. I really love getting the middle piece. And I was really happy with the texture too. These turned out really soft on the inside, much like the first ones, but the flavor was actually very different than the first batch. On the second batch of rolls, the pineapple sweetness was much more noticeable than the first batch of rolls, and I think that made these taste a lot more similar to the store-bought version. I think probably the longer cooking time on the first batch gave the tops a little bit of caramelization, which kind of overpowered the sweetness from the pineapple juice. So when it comes to making a sourdough copycat version of sweet Hawaiian rolls, I think batch number 2 was way better than the first batch, but either way, they are both delicious, and I'm about to make a whole bunch of pulled pork sliders with all of these rolls. If you'd like to make either version of these rolls at home, go ahead and give this video a thumbs up, then check out the video description for the ingredient list. I'll see you in the next video.